Marcus Williams sat at the piano in his apartment in Brooklyn, his fingers resting on keys he could not see but knew intimately. He was preparing for the biggest performance of his life, a solo concert at Carnegie Hall, the culmination of a career that had earned him 2 Grammy Awards in recognition as one of the finest jazz pianists of his generation. But tonight, his mind was not on the performance. It was on a question that had haunted him for 30 years, ever since he was a blind 7-year-old boy who walked into the Lighthouse School for the Blind in New Orleans and discovered that music could give him a life. Who paid for it? Someone had funded his entire education, his piano lessons, his teachers, his opportunities. Someone had made his career possible. And in all these years, despite searching, asking, investigating, Marcus had never learned who that anonymous benefactor was. Until 3 days ago, when an archivist named Sarah Chen called with an answer that made him cry. The person who had changed his life, who had funded the school that transformed blind children into musicians, who had given without ever taking credit, was Louis Armstrong. And Louis had never told anyone. The story begins in 1952, though its roots go deeper into Armstrong's own childhood in New Orleans at the turn of the century. Louis had grown up in brutal poverty, the kind that damages children in ways that never fully heal. His father abandoned the family when Louis was an infant. His mother worked as a prostitute to survive. Louis spent much of his early childhood living with his grandmother in a neighborhood so dangerous it was called the battlefield. He was hungry more often than fed, cold more often than warm, scared more often than safe. The world offered him nothing except music. When Louis was 11 years old, he was sent to the colored waif's home for boys after firing a pistol into the air on New Year's Eve, a stupid childhood mistake that became the pivot point of his entire life. At the waif's home, he was given a cornet and basic instruction. That horn was the first thing in Louis's life that felt like his, that responded to his effort, that gave back what he put in. Music became his language, his escape, his salvation. It took a boy with no future and gave him a path forward. Louis never forgot that. Never forgot that music had rescued him when nothing else could. By 1952, Louis Armstrong was one of the most famous musicians in the world. He had revolutionized jazz, toured globally, appeared in films, become wealthy beyond anything his childhood self could have imagined. But success had not erased the memory of being that desperate child, or the knowledge that music had been the only light in his darkness. He thought about that often, especially when he returned to New Orleans to perform and saw children living the same poverty he had known. He wanted to do something that mattered, something that would replicate what music had done for him, but Louis was also intensely private about his charitable giving. He did not believe in public philanthropy, did not trust the motives of celebrities who made sure everyone knew about their generosity. If he was going to help, it would be real help, not performance. The idea came to him during a conversation with his wife Lucille in their home in Corona, Queens. They were discussing a newspaper article about a proposed school for blind children in New Orleans that would focus on music education. The article mentioned that the school had support from local donors, but needed significant additional funding to open. Lucille watched Louis read the article 3 times, saw something shift in his expression. "You're thinking about helping them," she said. Louis nodded slowly. "Music saved me when I couldn't see any way out. Imagine what it could do for kids who actually can't see." The metaphor struck them both. Music as sight for the blind. Music as the thing that makes invisible futures visible. Louis made a decision that night. He would fund the school completely, provide whatever money was needed, but on one absolute condition: his name could never be attached to it. Ever? His manager, Joe Glazer, thought Louis was making a mistake. "You give this kind of money, you should get credit," Joe argued. "It's good for your image, shows you care, helps with certain audiences." But Louis was immovable. "This isn't about my image. This is about those kids getting a chance. You put my name on it, it becomes about me." "I don't want that." Joe recognized the tone. This was not negotiable, so they structured it carefully. Louis would donate through an anonymous trust managed by Joe's office. The school would receive regular payments sufficient to cover operations, teacher salaries, instruments, everything needed, but the source would remain completely confidential. The school's founder, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a blind music educator from Boston, would be told only that she had a committed anonymous benefactor who believed in her mission. The Lighthouse School for the Blind opened in September 1952 in a converted building in the Treem neighborhood of New Orleans. Dr. Chen ran it with fierce dedication, creating a curriculum that taught blind children not just music theory and performance, but how to navigate the world through sound, how to build confidence through artistic achievement, how to transform what society saw as disability into distinctive capability. The school accepted students regardless of their family's ability to pay. Many came from profound poverty, situations similar to what Louis had known. Some were children who had been written off by other schools, told they would never amount to anything because they could not see. At the lighthouse, they learned piano, saxophone, trumpet, bass, drums. They learned jazz, blues, classical music. They learned that their blindness did not limit what they could achieve, only how they would achieve it. And every month, like clockwork, the anonymous funding arrived, allowing Dr. Chen to keep the school running, to hire the best teachers, to provide instruments and opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. Louis never visited the school, never called to check on progress, never asked for updates or reports. He simply sent the money year after year and trusted Dr. Chen to use it well. The only communication was an annual letter that Joe Glazer would send on behalf of the anonymous donor, usually just a few lines expressing continued belief in the school's mission and confirming the next year's funding. Dr. Chen saved every letter, kept them in a file labeled Our Guardian Angel, though she had no idea who that angel was. She speculated privately that it might be a wealthy New Orleans family with a blind relative, or perhaps a group of donors pooling resources. The amounts were substantial, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars annually, enough to suggest serious wealth, but she never pushed to know more. The work mattered more than the credit. Lucille Armstrong was one of the few people who knew the truth, and she watched Louis's secret philanthropy with a mixture of pride and frustration. Proud because his generosity was genuine, untainted by ego or public relations. Frustrated because she saw how much joy the school brought him in private, how he would read the occasional newspaper article about the lighthouse and smile with quiet satisfaction, and she wished the world could see that side of him. You should visit, she suggested once. Just once, see what your money is doing. But Louis refused. The second I show up, it becomes about me. Kids start performing for Louis Armstrong instead of learning for themselves. Teachers start worrying about impressing the famous benefactor. It changes everything. This only works if I stay invisible. The years passed. The school thrived. By 1960, the Lighthouse School for the Blind had produced its first professional musicians, blind jazz players who were getting gigs, making records, supporting themselves through music. In 1965, a Lighthouse graduate named Thomas Reed became the first blind musician hired by a major symphony orchestra. In 1968, another graduate, Linda Morrison, released a blues album that reached the top 40. These successes thrilled Dr. Chen and her staff, validated their approach, proved that blind children, given the right opportunities, could achieve at the highest levels. None of them knew that the money making it all possible came from a man who had himself been saved by music, who understood in his bones what these children were experiencing, who was replicating his own rescue in their lives. By 1970, Louis Armstrong's health was failing. The years of relentless touring, smoking, the physical demands of trumpet playing had taken their toll. He suffered heart attacks, was hospitalized repeatedly, knew his time was limited. Joe Glazer had died in 1969, and Louis had to make arrangements for the school funding to continue after his own death. He worked with Lucille and his attorney to set up a permanent endowment that would keep sending money to the Lighthouse School indefinitely. The arrangement was ironclad-y. The source must remain anonymous. Even after his death, the funding would come through the trust with no indication of its origin. Louis wanted the school to survive him without ever knowing what he had done. In a sense, he wanted the good he had created in the world to be truly selfless, completely divorced from his reputation or legacy. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971. The world mourned. Tributes poured in from presidents, musicians, ordinary people whose lives his music had touched. But among the thousands of words written about his life and achievements, nothing mentioned the Lighthouse School for the Blind. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, reading his obituary in New Orleans, had no idea that her anonymous benefactor for nearly 2 decades had just died. The monthly checks continued arriving without interruption, the trust functioning exactly as Louis had designed it. The secret held, it held for 47 years. The Lighthouse School continued operating, expanding, producing generation after generation of blind musicians. By the 2000s, it had educated hundreds of students, many of whom went on to professional music careers. The anonymous benefactor became part of the school's mythology. This mysterious figure who had believed in Dr. Chen's vision and funded it so generously for so long. Students would speculate about who it was, creating elaborate theories. Teachers would joke that their guardian angel was probably watching over them still. Dr. Chen, who retired in 1995 but stayed closely connected to the school, maintained the file of annual letters, occasionally rereading them, still wondering after all these years who had made her life's work possible. In 2018, a music historian named Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Elizabeth Chen, was researching Louis Armstrong's financial records for a book about jazz musicians and money. She had been granted access to Armstrong's personal archives, including decades of tax records, trust documents, and correspondence. Sarah was looking for information about Armstrong's investments and business dealings when she found something unexpected. An anonymous trust established in 1952, funded entirely by Armstrong, that had been making substantial payments to an organization called the Lighthouse School for the Blind in New Orleans for 18 years during Armstrong's lifetime, and continuing after his death through an endowment he had created. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars across the decades. And nowhere in Armstrong's public record, in any interview, biography, or personal letter that had been published, was there any mention of it. Sarah was stunned. This was not just a charitable donation. This was a decades-long life-changing commitment that Armstrong had deliberately kept secret. She spent weeks verifying the information, making sure she had understood the documents correctly, checking whether the school still existed. It did. The Lighthouse School for the Blind, now called the Lighthouse Institute, was still operating in New Orleans, still teaching blind children music, still producing professional musicians. Sarah called the institute and asked to speak with someone about their founding. She was connected to Marcus Williams. Marcus had graduated from the Lighthouse School in 1988, a blind pianist who had gone on to Juilliard, then a professional career, then Grammy Awards and international recognition. He had stayed closely involved with the school, served on its board, donated money himself to give back to the place that had given him everything. When Sarah Chen called and introduced herself as a music historian researching Louis Armstrong, Marcus assumed she wanted to talk about Armstrong's musical influence. Instead, she asked, "Did you ever find out who your anonymous benefactor was? The person who funded the school for all those years?" Marcus's breath caught. "No, we've been trying to find out for decades." "Why, do you know?" Sarah's voice was gentle. "It was Louis Armstrong. He funded the school from 1952 until his death and set up an endowment to continue funding it afterward. He insisted it remain completely anonymous. You and every student who attended that school, your entire education was made possible by Louis Armstrong, and he never wanted you to know." Marcus Williams sat in silence, phone pressed to his ear, unable to speak. Louis Armstrong, the man whose music had inspired him to play piano, whose recordings he had studied obsessively, whose spirit and joy and genius had shaped Marcus's own approach to jazz. That Louis Armstrong had been his anonymous benefactor all along, had paid for his education, had made his career possible. Marcus thought about the hundreds of hours he had spent as a child learning piano in the Lighthouse School, never knowing that the money for his teacher, for the instrument, for the building itself, came from the greatest jazz musician who ever lived. He thought about the other students, the ones who had become professional musicians, who had built lives through the skills they learned at that school. All of it because Louis Armstrong believed blind children deserved a chance and believed it deeply enough to fund that chance for 18 years without ever taking credit. Sarah Chen sent Marcus copies of the documents, the trust agreements, the payment records, everything that proved the connection. Marcus contacted other Lighthouse graduates, the ones who had become musicians, who had succeeded in careers everyone had told them were impossible for blind people. He called Linda Morrison, the blues singer who had recorded her first album in 1968, now in her 70s and still performing. He called Thomas Reed's widow, Thomas having passed away in 2005 after a long career in symphonic music. He reached out to dozens of others, all of them bound together by having attended the same school, having received the same gift. And to each one, he said the same thing: "I found out who paid for it." It was Louis Armstrong. The revelation transformed how these musicians understood their own lives. They had all admired Armstrong, studied his music, been influenced by his artistry, but they had thought of him as a distant figure, a legend separated from their personal stories by fame and time. Now they understood he had been intimately involved in their lives all along, had bet on them when they were children, had given them the opportunities that made everything else possible. The gift was multiplied by its anonymity. Armstrong had not helped them to be thanked or recognized. He had helped because he believed music could save blind children the way it had saved a poor black child in New Orleans decades earlier. He had understood their darkness because he had known his own, and he had given them light without asking for anything in return. Marcus Williams decided to dedicate his Carnegie Hall concert to Louis Armstrong, not just to his musical legacy, but to his secret generosity, to the hidden kindness that had shaped so many lives. He invited every living Lighthouse graduate to attend. Linda Morrison came. So did dozens of others, blind musicians in their 50s, 60s, 70s, all of them gathered to honor a man who had died before many of them were born, but who had given them everything. Before the concert began, Marcus told the story to the audience. He explained about the Lighthouse School, the anonymous benefactor, the 47 years of secrecy, and the 2018 discovery that revealed Louis Armstrong had been their guardian angel all along. People in the audience were crying before Marcus played a single note. The concert that night was transcendent. Marcus performed pieces he had learned as a child at the Lighthouse School, jazz standards that Armstrong had recorded, improvisations that channeled the spirit of the man who had made it all possible. Every note was a thank you to someone who could not hear it, a tribute to generosity so pure it had demanded anonymity, a recognition of the profound truth that the greatest gifts are the ones given without expectation of return. When Marcus finished playing, the ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. People were not just applauding his performance. They were applauding the story, the revelation of hidden goodness, the proof that Louis Armstrong's legacy was even greater than anyone had known. The story broke publicly the next day. Major newspapers covered it, music magazines ran features, Armstrong biographers scrambled to incorporate this new information into their understanding of his life. The Lighthouse Institute saw a surge in donations as people inspired by Armstrong's example wanted to contribute to the work he had funded. The Institute established a scholarship fund in Armstrong's name, making public the connection he had insisted remain private, but doing so in a way that honored his values. The scholarship would go to blind children who showed musical promise but lacked resources, continuing the work Armstrong had begun 70 years earlier. Looking back, what makes Armstrong's secret philanthropy so remarkable is not just the money, though the amounts were substantial. It is the philosophy behind it. Armstrong understood that real generosity is about the recipient, not the giver. That help should empower rather than create dependency or obligation, that the greatest gifts are the ones that allow people to thrive without knowing whose hand lifted them up. He saw blind children and recognized his own childhood desperation, understood that music could be their salvation the way it had been his, and created a pathway for them without demanding gratitude or recognition. That level of selflessness is rare in any person, rarer still in someone famous enough that public charity would have been celebrated and praised. The students who benefited from Armstrong's generosity never performed for him, never thanked him, never knew his name was connected to their opportunities. And that was exactly how he wanted it, because he understood that the truest gift creates freedom, not obligation. He gave these children music, which gave them careers, which gave them independence and dignity and lives they could build on their own terms. They owed him nothing because he never wanted to be owed. The anonymity was not modesty. It was intentional liberation, the recognition that gifts freely given must be free in every sense. Today, Marcus Williams keeps a photograph of Louis Armstrong in his piano room. When he practices, when he performs, when he teaches his own students, he thinks about the man in that photograph who saw children in darkness and believed they deserved light, who funded their rescue without ever revealing himself as their rescuer, who understood that music is not just sound or art or entertainment, but a force that can transform lives, open futures, turn invisible possibilities visible. Louis Armstrong's music changed the world. Everyone knows that, but his secret generosity changed individual lives in ways those individuals only discovered decades later. Both legacies matter. Both reveal a man who understood that having been saved by music created an obligation to save others the same way, and that the highest form of that salvation is the kind that asks nothing for itself. The Lighthouse Institute still operates today, still teaches blind children music, still produces professional musicians. Every student who graduates receives a certificate that bears Louis Armstrong's name, acknowledgement of the gift that made their education possible. Most of these students do not fully understand the story yet, do not grasp that a jazz legend who died before they were born is the reason they have this opportunity, but someday they will. Someday they will be professionals themselves, established musicians building lives through their art, and someone will tell them the story of the anonymous benefactor who believed in them before they could believe in themselves. And in that moment, they will understand what Marcus Williams understood in 2018 that Louis Armstrong's greatest performance was not on stage or in a recording studio, but in the quiet, hidden work of giving blind children sight through music and doing it so completely without credit that the secret remained hidden for nearly 50 years after his death. That is not just generosity, that is grace.